As with all my videos dealing on foreign topics, foreign people, and foreign areas and foreign terms altogether, all pronunciations will be Americanized. Let's get into the concept and ideology of the Iraqi Ba'athist Party. The Ba'athist Party was able to bring stability from 1968 to its fall in 2003. Saddam Hussein would take full control in 1979, although he had large control since 68 to 79 as the vice president and ran many of the organizations. He was pretty much running the show anyways. It just became official in 1979. So all the way up to 2003, after the American-led invasion to depose Saddam Hussein, and then his kangaroo trial to follow, followed by his execution. So we'll examine the years prior to the Ba'athist Party. We'll go through the turmoil and turbulence of the consistent and constant coup d'etats that were coming left and right, with either deposing the monarchy, getting the British out of there, and then a slew of military coup d'etats pulled off. Then finally the Ba'ath gaining power first in 63, only to lose it really quickly, and then gaining it back in 68 and using what they had learned from their fall in 1963 to ensure that they're able to keep power, which they did until foreign invaders came and took it from them, and now gave them the confused, dysfunctional society. Hey, we brought them what we have, right? We ship it everywhere. You have unity, you have, solidarity. We're going to go and fractionize that, rip it apart, and give you a society where your citizens are fighting each other over everything. So we brought that to them too. Maybe one day, if they're good enough, if they're democratic enough, they'll be able to fight over what a gender is and what bathrooms should be used. There's only hope. There's hope that they could climb to that level of civilization that we bring the world. But yes, let's go into the concept and ideology of the Iraqi Ba'athist Party, led by Saddam Hussein. And for this video, we'll be taking a look at Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist Party, Inside an Authoritarian Regime, by Joseph Sassoon. So first, let's start with a brief history of Iraq. On July 17, 1968, the Arab Ba'athist Social Party launched a successful coup d'etat and began its 35-year domination of Iraq. The ascent of the Ba'ath Party, 5 years after its first brief interlude in power, was the result of a combination of historical, economic, and social factors that had led to the instability and repeated power vacuums in the decades leading up to July 1968. Modern Iraq was created from the amalgamation of three provinces of Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul, which constituted Mesopotamia, and had been a part of the Ottoman Empire for more than 4 centuries. When the First World War broke out, the British felt the need to protect their burgeoning oil and political interest in the region and launched a military campaign in Iraq. By 1918, they had come to control the 3 provinces, but soon found out that ruling the country proved significantly more difficult than occupying it. Iraq became a British mandate from 1920 until independence was granted in 1932, and King Faisal was installed as its first monarch in 1921. Iraqi nationalists initially rose up against foreign control in the summer of 1920, sparked by the announcement of the mandate a couple months earlier. This revolt was a turning point in the history of Iraqi nationalism, but it did not alter the nature of the occupation. The British continued to shape Iraqi institutions and tribal hierarchies throughout the 1920s and 1930s. However, although the mandate created the modern state of Iraq, it failed to establish nationhood among the 3 provinces that had been cobbled together, and successive Iraqi governments faced considerable challenges in dealing with the rich diversity of ethnic and religious groups, regional affiliations, and languages within their borders. Indeed, the mandate, perhaps understandably given the country's internal fractures and the overarching British interest, made the state the principal arena for the multiple struggles that would constitute a distinctively Iraqi politics. The implications were that those who controlled the state commanded its resources and allocated privileges to their supporters. The mandate continued officially until 1932, when the Kingdom of Iraq was granted independence under King Faisal I. So what we're seeing here is something very similar to the history of Syria, where you had a land for the longest time in regards to Iraq in control of the Ottoman Empire. That eventually withers away, and then you have European imperialism, mainly French and British in regards to the Middle East, that draw up the borders. Probably not enough thought put into it, but in both cases, Syria and Iraq, their given borders have a lot of conflicting religions, people, ethnicities, simple regional differences, etc. And this leads to a lot of chaos in these newly created modern states. So like Syria, what you get is a history of constant coup d'etats, constant revolutions. And just like that set the stage for the Ba'athist Party in Syria, it does so here in Iraq. So we continue on that path. The interwar period was characterized by the rise of Pan-Arabism, an ideology influenced by the educationalist Sati al-Hasri, whose advocacy of Arab nationalism influenced an entire generation through his position as Director General of Education. Al-Hasri emphasized the Arabic language, Arabic nationalism, and Arabic history, negating a sense of national Iraqi identity and generally excluding non-Arab, and to some extent non-Sunni, Iraqis from his plans to educate the younger generation. This period was fraught with communal tensions, tribal rebellions, and the increasing intrusion of the army into politics. When the Assyrian minority in northern Iraq demanded more autonomy, this was seen as a challenge to Iraq's national unity, and the army, under Bakr Siddiqui, the general in charge of the Mosul area, massacred hundreds of Assyrians in August 1933. Having gained prominence, Siddiqui launched Iraq's first coup d'etat in October 1936, thus signaling the active entry of military into politics and creating a precedent for the use of violence to settle political disputes. The next historical milestone that influenced Saddam Hussein and Ba'athist ideology was the coup d'etat of April 1941. Bakr Siddiqui was assassinated in 1937, 10 months after his successful coup, and the country entered a period of instability. Another coup took place in 1938, installing Nur al-Said as prime minister. The 1941 coup, unlike previous ones, was targeted against the monarchy itself, rather than just replacing a prime minister. The regent, Abd al-Allah, appointed because King Faisal II was still a minor, was deposed, and Rashid Ali Kailani formed a cabinet with the support of 4 colonels, known as the Golden Square. Britain, in the midst of the Second World War, asked permission for its troops to cross through Iraq in accordance with the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930, which was designed to protect its interest in the region. Under pressure from the colonels, Rashid Ali denied the British request, thus reneging on the treaty. Hostilities between the two nations broke out, and there was a brief period of fighting, known as the Anglo-Iraqi War, which lasted for 30 days. Iraqi forces succumbed to British military pressure, especially from the Royal Air Force. A power vacuum existed for a couple of days between the collapse of the government and the re-establishment of British control over the country, which continued directly and indirectly until 1958. One consequence of this vacuum was 2 days of carnage against the Jewish community of Baghdad, regarded as pro-British, which lasted until order was re-established. After the war, the 4 colonels were tried and hanged. thus becoming martyrs in the eyes of many Iraqi nationalists. Saddam Hussein recounted in his books that when he was a young boy, his uncle told him numerous stories about the courage and patriotism of those colonels, and that he looked up to them as role models. The 1948 war in Palestine between the newly independent Israeli state and surrounding Arab countries had a profound impact on Iraq and the Arab world. Pan-Arab policy was strengthened and pro-British policies discredited. With calls for independence from British influence increasing day by day, the Iraqi Jewish community, which numbered more than 150,000 and played an important role in the country's commercial and cultural life, dwindled to about 30,000, leaving a void in the business world that was filled mostly by Shiite merchants. In the 1950s, the dramatic increase in oil reserves stimulated economic development, which enabled the government to embark on large construction projects on numerous occasions. Demands to improve labor conditions turned into violent demonstrations. Many of the strikes were planned by the Communist Party, which was the most organized political entity outside of the government and enjoyed a loyal following. In 1952, the overthrow of the monarchy in Egypt galvanized Iraqi officers into contemplating an overthrow of their own monarchy. While Iraq was making progress in terms of social welfare, frustrations surrounding its foreign policy were increasing. These reached a breaking point during the Suez War of 1956, when Egypt was attacked by Britain, France, and Israel. Iraqis felt that their country could no longer stay on the side of the British, and young officers were encouraged to instigate the revolution that led to the declaration of Iraq as a republic on July 14, 1958. During this period, the Ba'ath Party emerged in Iraq, established in Syria in 1943 by a small circle of young intellectuals and led by Michel Aflaq, a Christian, and Salal al-Din al-Bitar, a Sunni Muslim. The Ba'ath, which means resurrection or revival, saw itself as an Arab rather than a Syrian party. Aflaq told the historian Hana Batatu that everyone sensed that there was a vacuum, that the old leadership had gone bankrupt, that a new movement had to be set on foot. The events in Palestine in 1948 increased the new party's appeal, and their leaders saw the gaps between the governments and their peoples in the Arab world as an opportunity to expand their political base. Its popularity benefited from the fact that the Iraqi Communist Party was tainted by the Soviet Union's decision to recognize Israel. Ba'ath ideology reached Iraq in the late 1940s and found receptive ears among university students. Fuad al-Rikabi became the leader of the Iraqi Party in 1951, and young members were gradually recruited, including Saddam Hussein in 1956. The party regarded itself as the vanguard and leader of the Arab Revolution. Even by 1955, however, its members numbered only about 300, and its influence among army officers was limited. Following in the footsteps of the Egyptian Free Officers, Iraqi's Free Officers launched the July 1958 revolution that toppled the monarchy, created the Iraqi Republic, and inaugurated a new era in Iraq's history of coups d'etats and instability. The swift success of the coup was due more to the feelings of resentment and the desire for change on the part of large segments of the population, rather than to devotion to a consistent ideology or a coherent group of activists. The violent end of the royal family, they're gunned down, and of the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Said, instituted the use of public violence to resolve political disputes. Indeed, the public trials of senior officers of the monarchy that were broadcast on television were yet another pointer to the future. The proceedings of many of these trials became a farce, interrupted by people waving ropes and calling for the hanging of certain ministers and officers. Under the circumstances, it is surprising that only a handful of those arrested were actually executed. The two leaders of the 1958 revolution among the free officers were Brigadier Abd al-Karim Qassam and Colonel Abd al-Salam Arif. A rift soon developed between them, and their struggle for power became a clash of personalities and ideals. Qasim emerged as a leader after skillfully maneuvering between nationalist and communist, and not allowing either side to become too powerful. Arif, who supported a union with Egypt, was arrested and sentenced to death, and for a while the communists seemed to be gaining power. The 1958 revolution allowed them to come into the open for the first time and to play a part in running the country. In March 1959, the underlying tensions erupted in the Mosul revolt, led by a pro-unionist army officer, and the turmoil symbolized the complexity of the various conflicts that permeated Iraqi politics and society. Supported by Egypt, which was by then very openly hostile to Qasim's regime, the revolt was poorly planned and easily crushed by Iraqi troops loyal to Qasim. Its aftermath, however, left a deep scar on Iraqi's history. Kurds attacked Turkomans who supported the revolt, and communists massacred nationalists. Looting in Mosul and summary executions reflected the deep divide between Kurds and Arabs, peasants and landlords, communists and nationalists. Qasim began to view the communists as a threat to his regime and gradually curtailed their power, but they were left with little alternative except to support him to the end, because they saw him as their best option. Over the years, the Communist Party played an important role in Iraq's political history, even though it was almost perpetually in opposition. It attracted many followers during the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s, including members of religious minorities and a large number of intellectuals. This caused concern not only for the monarchy, but also for the West, as it paralleled the intensification of the Cold War during the 1950s. But by late 1959, the influence of the communists in Iraq had peaked. The same year, 1959, witnessed an attempt to assassinate Qasim. On October 7th, a group of young Baathists, including Saddam Hussein, attempted to shoot Qasim as his car drove along its daily route, along the famous Rashid Street. Although Qasim was injured, he recovered quickly, and many of the plotters, including Saddam Hussein, fled the country. Others were arrested, and their trial brought the Ba'ath Party to public attention for the first time. After initially fleeing to Syria, Saddam Hussein moved to Cairo, using his time there to further his education while staying in close touch with other Iraqi exiles in Egypt. Once Qasim had gained the upper hand against Arif, he became known in the media as the sole leader. Qasim's approach of playing different political groups against one another, including some that supported him, alienated many of his natural allies, the Kurds in particular. His war against the Kurds, with whom he had initially attempted to be reconciled, was the first of many campaigns conducted by successive Iraqi governments until 1991, in attempts to crush the guerrillas ensconced in the northern mountains, who enjoyed the support of the local population. Yet Qasim forgave many of those who plotted against him, commuted many death sentences issued by the People's Court, and pardoned Arif, who would later become president. As Sluggets puts it, Qasim's failings, serious as they were, can scarcely be discussed in the same terms and venality of savagery of the wanton brutality characteristic of many of the regimes which followed his own. Although the record of Qasim's regime was mixed, there's little doubt that much-needed social reform was launched and that his regime helped to make a society somewhat more egalitarian after decades of monarchical rule, during which large landlords not only controlled agricultural land, but had inordinate influence over the country's politics. In fact, it could be argued that the 1950s were characterized by the growing gap on the one hand between the monarchy and its supporters, and on the other hand between many political, economic, and social groups in the urban centers of the country. More than any of the rulers before him, Qasim was sensitive to the diversity of Iraq and the need to create some cohesion among different groups. The military became an active player in politics, intervening time and again, generating more instability and backing successive authoritarian regimes. Indeed, all regimes from 1958 onward had to focus their attention on coup-proofing, but only Saddam Hussein truly mastered that art. Having carefully observed the turbulent events in his country between 1958 and 1968, to secure the loyalty of the military, all regimes after 1958 appeased the officer corps and granted it more privileges. It was therefore not surprising that the youth, who had no chance of pursuing a career in such prestigious fields as medicine or engineering, would look to the officer corps. The year 1963, described by Batatu as the bitterest of years, witnessed violence, assassinations, coups d'etats, and changes of the regime, and exposed elements of instability in Iraq at their most raw. Airplanes and tanks were used in the heart of Baghdad by the Baathists and their allies, forcing Qasim to surrender at his headquarters in the Ministry of Defense on February 9, 1963. Almost a day after the revolt against him began. Qasim and a few aides were given a summary trial, and all were executed shortly afterward by firing squad. Overnight, the sole leader of the country became the enemy of the people, and his body and those of his associates were shown repeatedly on Iraqi television to prove to their supporters that Qasim's regime had come to an end. In the ensuing violence, Batatu estimated that about 5,000 communists were killed in the 2 days from February 8th to 10th as part of the relentless hunt by the National Guard, a militia created by the Ba'athist Party. The new regime that came to power drew its support from a small but determined group of plotters able to draw on wider elements of disaffection in the military. The Ba'ath's first 9 months in office between February 8th and November 18th, 1963, are important for understanding the party's structure and the system it developed when it returned to power in 1968. The experience gained in 1963 was a significant turning point in the history of the Ba'ath. It was the first real test of applying the party's ideology to the country's economic, social, and political problems. In 1963, the party realized that it was the highest constitutional authority, but that it did not have the necessary support networks in place. Hence, after 1968, the Ba'ath made more strenuous efforts to create solid local support, and under Saddam Hussein's leadership, it built powerful security organizations that could crush any resistance in its infancy. In 1963, the number of Ba'ath Party members was estimated to be a mere 3,000. But after 1968, its leadership put in place a number of efficient systems to penetrate society and expand the party's power base. Saddam Hussein learned 3 bitter lessons from 1963 that he was determined not to repeat: to avoid ideological splits within the party and any competition for leadership, to weaken the military to prevent coups d'etats, and finally, to control the levers of power, such as the security organizations, as this was critical to retaining political control. During the initial period after the party took over in 1963, there was a sense of anarchy throughout the country. 5 years later, in 1968, the leadership was resolved not to tolerate such a chaotic atmosphere. However, in 1963, the party had no experience in governing the country, and its leadership was far from united on the course it should follow in almost every important respect, with the exception of rooting out the communists. One ex-Ba'athist describes vividly his memories of the vociferousness of the party leadership and the running tension between older military officers and young party militants. Friction between the two political factions of the party, the so-called rightists and leftists, was mostly concentrated around the issues of unity with Egypt and the nature of social and economic reforms, and turned into a clash of personalities and hunger for power. As one of the Ba'athist leaders at the time later said, "We were not prepared for power. We had spent all of our time underground preparing for conspiracy." Another member emphasized that the secrecy under which the party operated caused the rise of personal rivals and tendencies and the abandonment of the principle of collective leadership. The 8th Regional Congress summed up the lessons of that period. The leadership of the 1963 revolution, i.e. the leadership of the party at that time, failed to practice its role as a leadership of the revolutionary party. The party machine was left without precise and comprehensive central guidance. The party consequently was unable to act as a vanguard revolutionary institution leading the revolution as it should, regardless of the prevailing circumstances and the risks. It lost the initiative, and thus regression became simple and possible. Having learned from the lessons of the 1963 debacle, a well-oiled machine was constructed with a centralized hierarchy providing detailed guidance on every aspect of life in the country. Another outcome of the 1963 period was the increasing deterioration of relations between the Iraqi and Syrian Ba'ath parties. This was partly the result of the continual meddling of the movement's co-founder, Aflaq, in the politics of both countries. But it mostly resulted from the desire of the Syrian rulers to monopolize Ba'athist legitimacy and prevent their supporters from shifting alliance to the Iraqi wing. Al-Assam Arif, who had been pardoned by Qasim, became president after the February 1963 coup, even though he was not a Ba'athist. He manipulated the Ba'ath party into giving him the presidency. In November that year, he engineered another coup to oust the Ba'ath party from power, and a new page in Iraqi's history began. With the reign of the Arif brothers, Abd al-Salam from 63 to 66 and Abd al-Rahman from 66 to July 1968. As Batatu explains, the coalition of military Baathists, Arifites, and Nasrites was a coalition of competing groups and therefore inherently unstable, and the Baathists lost in this contest. Creating the Republican Guard as a Praetorian militia within the army presaged a centralization of systems of power and personal loyalty that was ruthlessly perfected under Saddam Hussein. Whereas Arif relied on army officers who he could trust, Saddam Hussein replaced them with his civilian comrades from the party, to whom he granted military titles. Most members of the new regime, Arifs, were admirers of President Nasser of Egypt, or else Arab nationalists. But Arif policy combined strong pan-Arab nationalism with a social conservatism derived from his devout Muslim faith. The continuing clash between Iraq's Nasserites and the more moderate nationalists continued. Meanwhile, by 1965, Egypt and Iraq were becoming less enthusiastic about a union, as both countries realized the pragmatic obstacles involved. The Nasserites lost their influence when a coup by the Nasserite prime minister was foiled by supporters of Arif. In spite of the proposed union, bilateral relations with Egypt were as turbulent as other aspects of Iraq's history. Only 1 year earlier, a Ba'ath plot was discovered in the armed forces, and Egypt sent troops as a sign in support of Arif's regime. Feeling secure in his position, he appointed a civilian prime minister for the first time since the 1958 revolution, Abdul al-Rahman al-Bazaz, an Arab nationalist and a former dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Baghdad, formed a government with more civilians than military men. He stressed the rule of law, initiated economic and foreign policy measures that began to change Iraq's image abroad, and created optimism within the country. In April 1966, Abdul al-Salam Arif was killed in a helicopter crash caused by a sandstorm and was replaced by his brother, Abdul al-Rahman Arif, who was chief of staff at the time. The government was engaged in yet another war against the Kurds, and al-Bazaz, who was reappointed prime minister by the new president, was determined to find a solution. However, neither his decision to accede to the Kurds' demands nor his liberalization policies endured him to the military or the Nasserites. The day after the publication of the agreement with the Kurds, an attempted coup took place. The Nasserites who had organized it were defeated, but not before they managed to bomb the presidential palace after gaining control of some Air Force bases. Thus, the short period of reform and civilian rule came to an end. Al-Bazaz was replaced by prime ministers who were all military men, proving once again their indispensability. Unlike his brother, the newly installed Arif was not capable of consolidating the patronage system that had been established, and rivalries began to surface among the different factions in the country in a struggle for power. Amid this volatile political climate, the military defeat of Arab armies by Israel in June 1967 war sent shudders through Iraq, as well as other Arab countries. Although Iraq was not a key state in this war and suffered few losses, the consequences of the defeat were enormous and led to a weakening of the legitimacy of military regimes as the most effective form of Arab government. At the same time, significant progress was achieved in the oil industry. Iraq asserted its influence versus the Iraqi Petroleum Company, the IPC, which was the consortium of foreign oil companies, and granted the right to drill oil in territories not covered by the IPC to Iraqi National Oil Company. The first step in controlling Iraqi's oil resources began during Qasim's era, when the government expropriated most of the IPC's concessions. Creating Iraq's own oil company was a second step, and the process culminated in the nationalization of the IPC in 1972 and 73 under Saddam Hussein's tutelage. The broader industrialization of the country, however, moved ahead only slowly. The average growth for industrial production for the years 1962 to 69 was a modest 5.2%, compared to about the 11% for 1953 to 58. Overall, the economy stagnated, and the country's reliance on oil reserves continued, with oil accounting for more than 90% of exports. At the end of 1960, the economic situation was aptly summed up by Al-Ansari. The political instability and the frequent occurrence of coups d'etats since 1958 have inflicted heavy human, political, social, and economic damages on a country striving for progress. The instability delayed the implementation of agrarian reform, discouraged industrial and agricultural development efforts, increased the economy's dependence on the oil sector, and finally led to a virtual economic stagnation. After losing power in November 1963, the Ba'ath Party was in crisis. Its leaders were split among themselves, each blaming the other for the failures of this first term in office. Aflaq intervened, and a new national leadership was created, with Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein in the regional command, the party's top decision-making body. This was a major accomplishment for the young Saddam Hussein, who was not very well known and still in his 20s. From the beginning, he wanted to extend his control of the party, and he took advantage of his appointment as the head of its intelligence and security arm. In September 1964, when the Ba'ath's attempted coup against Arif failed, Saddam Hussein was among the leaders who were imprisoned. He was incarcerated for about 2 years until he managed to escape, although it seems that conditions were not as harsh as those that awaited his enemies years later. He was able to see his family and his 6-month-old son Uday, and he sent messages to al-Bakr concealed in baby clothing. Arif was either too forgiving or felt sufficiently secure in his position to seek retribution. Hence, a dual policy developed where some Ba'ath members were persecuted while others were allowed to carry on relatively unhindered. Abdel al-Rahman Arif, aware of his own political weakness, met regularly with al-Bakr and tried to list the Ba'ath as part of the national coalition. No serious efforts were made to capture Saddam Hussein after his escape, and by the end of 1966, at the age of 29, he became Deputy Secretary General of the party. The rift between the Ba'ath parties in Syria and Iraq widened. In February 1966, a military coup by the party's left wing in Syria forced Aflaq and the Syrian leadership to seek refuge in Iraq. From that point on, despite short periods of rapprochement, the chasm between the so-called left wing in Syria and the right wing supported by al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein was never bridged. The Iraqi Ba'ath, realizing the diminishing appeal both of Nasserism and Pan-Arabism, particularly after June 1967, took a critical stand against Nasser and his policies in the Arab world, thus gaining popularity among the nationalists in Iraq. Indeed, the weakness of Arabism in Iraq compared with Syria was one of the distinguishing features of the two ideologies. And that Pan-Arabism never caught on, really. They were never able to unite the Arab nations and have a solidified voice amongst them. Regional competition continued, with Saddam Hussein determined never to allow the Syrian branch to become the Ba'ath headquarters in the Arab world. Aflaq remained in Iraq until his death and was treated with utmost respect by Saddam Hussein as the founding father of the party. Antagonism between the two countries continued to deepen to the extent that the Ba'ath of Syria joined the coalition to liberate Kuwait from Iraq's occupation in 1991. So, although both called themselves the Ba'athist Party, both stemmed from the same creation since the late 60s, they were never on the same page with each other. In fact, at times, direct odds with each other. The Iraqi Ba'ath consolidated its organization, taking advantage of the political uncertainty and the crisis in the political confidence that shook Iraq at the end of 1967. The public disappointment with the Arif brothers, particularly after the 1967 war, which undermined their legitimacy, the diminishing attractiveness of Pan-Arabism, the weakening of the communists that had begun in 1963, and finally the growing interest in Ba'ath ideology, which lacked detailed specifics but could appeal to large sectors of the population. Describing the period prior to the July 1968 coup, when the Ba'ath took over, the political report of the 8th Regional Congress stated that the past phase has been like a difficult birth, full of experiences, problems, success, failure, progress, and retreat. In reality, the Ba'ath policy between November 1963, when they lost power, and July 1968, when they came back to power, focused on how to seize power, rather than on constructing political programs to attract new members. The party's new leadership distanced itself from those who were identified with the February to November 1963 period, such as Ali Salah al-Sadid, and managed to strengthen its support within the military and civil structures, the latter orchestrated by Saddam Hussein. The infighting within the Arif regime persisted, while a standstill in the war against the Kurds created further frustration among the officer corps. The Ba'athists were in touch with many senior officers, leading to an arrangement with the Director of Military Intelligence and the Commander of the Republican Guard, whereby the two sides would withdraw their support from Arif. On July 17, 1968, Arif was forced to resign, but was allowed to go into exile because he did not present any real threat to the party. Years later, Saddam would recount the peaceful transition of power and express his pride that not a single drop of blood was shed. A 7-man revolutionary council was set up consisting only of military personnel, and the Ba'ath Party, conscious of its mistakes and rivalries in 1963, moved quickly to consolidate its support among the military. 13 days after this first peaceful coup, 2 colonels and another independent were exiled or appointed as ambassadors, and the Ba'ath takeover was complete. So that is how the Ba'ath came into power. Not quite Saddam Hussein yet. In 1979, around 10 years later, he would come into full power. But yeah, so a long history of coup d'etats, revolutions, power changing, of vacuums left by the power changing to be taken over by someone else, to be exploited by another person or party, and then once again another coup d'etat, and repeat. I mean, this has happened throughout the Arab world over and over again, especially after the the French and the British colonizers drew up specific borders for the countries like Syria and Iraq, and without really taking into much consideration the religious differences between the Sunnis and the Shia, or the fact that both of these countries had to deal with a Kurdish population. So when you have a chaotic situation like that, diverse religion and ethnicities and differing cultures in there, it takes the strong organization and the strong man to come in there and by whatever means necessary create some kind of solidarity and unification to get the nation going, prospering. And this is essentially what Saddam Hussein did for over 20 years until he was deposed from power by America in the early 2000s. So now that we went over how the quick history of Iraq and how the Ba'ath came into power, let's look into who the Ba'ath were and how they operated as we go into the party structure and organization. The Ba'ath Party played a crucial role in decision-making in Iraq, and in many ways its structure was similar to that of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Both societies could be termed mono-organizational because all activities were run by hierarchies of appointed officials under a single command. As the Ba'ath Party expanded in size, the governing responsibilities, bureaucratization, became critical for its success. Ba'ath documents clearly show that there was an elaborate division of labor, and goals and decisions were formulated at the apex of a pyramid, so that organizational success depends on each participant precisely performing his task as prescribed, without his needing to understand the system as a whole or even support its goals. This was important given that Iraq officially became a Ba'athist country after the party came to power in 1968. We have to emphasize that this society is led by a party, and that party is the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, which leads the people in its values, its organizations, and also leads it in its ideas and policies. Thus, it is necessary that the party's values and ideologies are at the forefront of these activities and throughout the country's decision-making apparatus. In order to ensure that the party permeated and controlled every facet of life in Iraq, its members occupied most of the important positions in the country. In 1974, the political report of the 8th Regional Congress of the party declared that it had succeeded in consolidating its leadership to an extent that makes it capable of safeguarding the regime and apply its programs. However, the report admitted that the phase was not free of many errors and negative aspects. Among these errors were steps by the party in placing party members in sensitive government posts that were necessary but produced some negative results. Centralization of power was a key element of the Ba'athist strategy. The 8th Congress report announced that the second most important task facing the revolution, after liquidating foreign intelligence networks and agents, was to build a strong and central national authority. Hence, every major decision in the ruling party was centralized through the party's secretariat. In essence, the party's board of directors, in a memo distributed by the RCC to all ministries, it decreed that all correspondence between state ministries and party organizations are to be sent through the party secretariat. And the RCC was the Ba'athist Regional Command Collection. The functions and specialization of the party's secretariat were drawn up in a clear and meticulous way. The secretariat hierarchy was formulated according to the directive distributed by the office of the president, and the functions of each department and section were clearly defined. The secretariat encompassed every branch within the party, which in turn controlled every aspect of civil and military life in the country. The complexity of the hierarchical structure that needed to be negotiated to reach any small ruling that affected the party or Iraqi citizens showed the depth of the bureaucratization. Needless to say, decision-making was cumbersome and inefficient, but at the same time, it gave Saddam Hussein the ability to govern without having to fear that too much power would fall into the hands of rivals. The Department for Organizational and Political Affairs was probably the most important within the organization, as it prepared the material for discussions based on orders of the party's Secretary General, Saddam Hussein, and then proceeded to carry out those orders. In addition, it was responsible for the following up on political matters with all branches of the party. One of its subsections, the Private Information Section, had the job of collating information of any candidate applying for a significant position within the party or the government apparatus. Some departments dealt with admission to military colleges, higher education institutions, and the Saddam Institute for Study of the Quran, which was used to influence religious life in the country. The control of admissions to these institutions was paramount for the party to establish and expand its authority at all levels of society, and to prevent other parties from increasing their influence with students or military cadets. Organizationally, the Regional Command was the highest authority in the party in Iraq after its split from the Syrian Ba'ath Party in 1966. So slowly establishing the process of getting Ba'ath members into all positions of influence in military, in education, in the economic sector, and so on. We go to the party's functions. Like any large corporation, every section and division had to file an annual report presenting its achievements in the format prescribed by the party secretariat. Each section had to put together statistics on current membership, recruitment of new members, conferences and meetings arranged with other sections, future prospects, cultural activities and forms, and popular events such as celebrations or special occasions dictated by the leadership. In addition, the sections carried out security activities, which included training members and capturing the regime's enemies. The party cadre was in charge of arresting agents of the Kurdish Democratic Party, KDP, tracking the activities of its members outside of Iraq, reporting on the different tribes in the area and ensuring their loyalty, recruiting informers and encouraging the local population to provide information about the regime's enemies. Party members were also active in remote areas of Kurdistan in supplying food or helping with literacy campaigns in an attempt to reduce the influence of the KDP and its agents. Like any successful concern, the Ba'ath Party needed to ensure that it was run on financial sound basis, and it paid a lot of attention to its finances. Apart from a generous allocation by the RCC, the party collected fees and contributions from its members. Fees were commensurate with rank. In 1998, for example, a supporter would pay only 25 Iraqi dinar, ID, about 3 cents, whereas a branch member had to pay roughly around $3. Fees were party discipline. Saddam Hussein was a great believer in discipline. In the novels he wrote, always published anonymously as a novel by its author, although their authorship was understood by all people in Iraq, he reiterated his belief that lack of organization and poor preparation are behind every failure. His predilection for party discipline is highlighted in many documents. He believed that discipline should take precedent over everything else for military cadets and for young party members. Consistent with his disciplinary style, the party issued a myriad of rules and regulations ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous. Stiff measures were taken against corruption and abuses of power by senior members. In one case, a senior member obtained a license for a friend to open a bar and was paid for that service. He was disciplined and demoted. In another case, a branch member who produced exaggerated written reports was demoted due to his lack of credibility. Sometimes punishments were for abuses of power by party members against members of security services. Senior members were scorned if they used their party vehicles for private trips. Party members were expected to arrive at their jobs punctually and to stay until the end of working hours. Lists were collected of those arriving late or those leaving before the end of their shift. A note was made in their files, and in many cases, either they were reprimanded immediately or the issue came up in their annual reviews. Control over the lives of members took other forms. They had to receive approval from the party secretariat before marriage, as did army officers. Each member had to complete a form with information about his or her prospective spouse and the spouse's family, even if the spouse was also a party member. In an internal document on checking marriage approval forms, party branches were ordered to check thoroughly the Arabic origin of not only the prospective wife, but also her family. And no approval should be given to a member who planned to marry someone from non-Arab origin. Once the war with Iran had erupted, the party had to confront the issue of affiliates who were of Iranian nationality. One memo from the party secretariat addressed directly to Saddam Hussein informed him that the party suffers from the existence of members who are not originally Arabs, as this might constitute a danger to the party in the future. So within their officers and members, they're paying attention to the race and ethnicity even of who people are choosing to marry. And so this just wasn't a thing that the German SS did. The North Koreans do it today, and the Iraqis did it amongst other people. And that's, of course, any kind of nationalist political entity with any kind of common sense is going to have that mentality, because you understand if your members or citizens marry a bunch of foreigners, well, that's going to change the makeup of the nation. It's not going to be from the same creation and wellspring that nation stemmed from, and what's constitutes the majority of the people and the expression of those people into their culture and traditions, etc. So they paid attention to that kind of stuff. The memo recommended that no member of Iranian origin should be given the honor of membership. Saddam Hussein wrote in the margins, "I agree with the opinion of the party secretariat to be discussed in the command meeting. Many of those whom the party refused to bestow membership were loyal Baathists. One man joined the party in 1958 and was arrested after the collapse of the first Baath regime in November 1963. Although 5 members wrote recommendations about him, he was refused membership due to his Iranian origins." Let's get into a little bit of the membership and recruitment. Saddam Hussein was very frank in discussing his strategy. In the mid-1970s, he declared that it should be our ambition to make all Iraqis in the country Baathist in membership and belief, or in the latter only. This stood in sharp contrast to the 1990s, when adding members took priority over believing in the Baathist ideology. In fact, 2 concepts developed during that period: affiliation and membership. Under the former, masses of Iraqis became affiliated, but only a small percentage were active members. Like any organization, the party membership was very hierarchical and was based on depth and commitment of years of service. At the lowest level, the sympathizer was only required to attend weekly meetings, and as this group made up the solid core of new recruits, they received intense political education to prepare them for the next stage, becoming a supporter. Progressing through the ranks meant devoting significant time and effort to serving the party, and it could take 5 to 10 years to become an active member. At the top of every political branch, section, and division, there was a Secretary General who was in charge of running the unit and handled all correspondence with the party secretariat. In northern Iraq, potential members had to pass through an additional layer, national activity, before even joining the ranks of sympathizers. And sometimes it took 2 to 3 years to become a sympathizer. Yearly evaluations and obedience to the party were very essential to reach a higher rank. The evaluations gave a clear indication of what was expected from members wishing to climb the hierarchical ladder: loyalty, abiding by party rules and regulations, hard work, modesty, and last but not least, following the example of the leader in bravery and carrying out the responsibility of being a Baathist. In addition to displaying these qualities, an active member wishing to progress to division membership must possess leadership and organizational abilities, as well as being a good exponent of the Baathist ideals. Needless to say, numerous forms had to be filled out by the applicant and by several references before any promotion could be given. Details about the applicant's political work, commitment to the party and its leader, participation in battles or missions for the regime, voluntary activities in one of the popular militias, and the ability to recruit new entrants were all assessed before a decision was reached. According to one of the forms, an applicant's promotion was delayed 6 months because he did not attend a party meeting or would arrive late with lame excuses. In essence, it is not sufficient for a member just to believe the idea of the party, but what is required is total commitment and not simply a political affiliation. So it's a very meticulous process you're seeing. There's a lot of rungs on the ladder as you're climbing to a higher position. A lot of hurdles to get over. But they were very meticulous in documenting the behavior of party members. So during their annual review, when people were looking for promotions, they can go over their behavior and deem whether these people were serious about their party membership or if they were just a part of the party to get some of the benefits of it. Once a member fulfilled all conditions and managed to reach the rank of candidate, he or she had to go through a political education courses followed by the ceremonial oath reiteration in front of a group of senior Baathists. This was a rite of passage for all members, and being part of the Baath involved considerable symbolism and ritual. The personal files of each applicant held the names of the senior members who had witnessed his or her swearing of allegiance to the party, and this was a vital feature of a member's record. Right, the life of a member. Each member was required to complete a detailed questionnaire recording his or her personal life and family. All were warned that those details would be checked thoroughly and would remain on their personal files throughout their careers. There were 36 questions, among them topics such as education, hobbies, how the candidate was introduced to party ideology, and how he or she responded to those ideas. Who were the people responsible for the first cell that the candidate joined? The time and place of swearing allegiance to the party, activities on behalf of the party at every stage, attendance at party conferences, particularly who participated and what left a lasting impression, an exhaustive history of where the candidate was during the events of 1958, 1959, and 1963, and after November 1963. Including any imprisonment. And finally, the role, if any, during the July 1968 coup d'etat. The duties of each member were extensive, including total commitment to party policy without arguing about orders and instructions issued, payment of membership fees, joining of organization or the union related to members' profession, putting the members' interests below those of the party, and the practice of self-criticism. Party political education. The Ba'athist cultural policy was run by the Ministry of Culture and Information, which played an important part in the intellectual guidance of the population through the media, as well as through Saddam's copious speeches and special education and cultural programs targeting different sections of society. The issue of culture has been covered extensively by certain scholars, and the emphasis here is on understanding how the regime dealt with political education within the party structure. In the study prepared in 1984 for the mobilization of the people to clearly understand the principles of the party, it made 6 recommendations. Number 1, deploying the media, television, radio, and newspapers to explain the party's principles. Number 2, communicating with the masses via professional unions, labor, women, students. 3, making use of videos, which became popular in the mid-1980s, of conferences and lectures by senior party members. Number 4, utilizing Saddam Hussein's speeches and his various life experiences. 5, capitalizing on youth centers in small villages and towns to attract more people by taking advantage of poets, writers, and artists to deliver the party's message to the crowds. And number 6, using all forms of popular expression or entertainment such as cinema, murals, sports, folklore, music, paintings, etc. to mobilize people. Internally, although indoctrination was spread through all the preceding approaches, it was epitomized most of all in courses in the party preparatory school, which was set up to develop party cadres. Clear targets for political education were established for each level of party hierarchy. Hence, for sympathizers, the courses were more a general overview of the party's history, its principles, and its internal application of party terminology and discipline. And I gotta say, when you compare, my personal opinion here real fast, when you compare the structure from the Iraqi Ba'ath and the Syrian Ba'ath, I mean, there was a lot more discipline and structure within the Iraqi Ba'ath for sure. The school aimed at creating a sense of comradeship among participants, and each tutor was expected to develop strong relations with the attendees and get a good sense of their future potential in the party. In theory, attendees were free to criticize the party and suggest new ideas. Saddam Hussein encouraged self-criticism. And in 1974, he told a meeting of party cadres at a preparatory school that, as a Ba'athist, free and honest speech, rather than finding excuses, is a necessity, and that members should not shy away from criticizing existing structures and roles. So this is another huge myth when it comes to third position ideology, that, there is no dissenting thought. Self-criticism is always encouraged, and throughout history of every example of third position governments that were in power or got close to power or were simply just political organizations that failed to get in power, there was always levels of self-criticism. You were always able to say, well, is this the best way forward? Should we change this? So we change this. and every party structure has changed and grown throughout their existence. So there's this myth that, as soon as you criticize the path the leader's taking, they're going to put you in jail and kill you or something. And this is just completely not true. Self-criticism is encouraged. Now, there's a fine line between self-criticism and subversion. Now, subversion is not allowed. And I would imagine any criticism on any major topic, it would be easy to see, even if that criticism wasn't accepted by leadership, and a year had passed and come to find out that criticism was accurate and probably the best way forward, the system would change to that. It would acknowledge that and move forward through using that. So it's not, third position is a very organic political philosophy. It is constantly evolving. In the mid-1990s, another theme was added, the party and religion. During courses, candidates had to write essays on topics chosen by the supervisors from these themes. One list of 40 topics included the commands of the leader and the impact on the Ba'athist personality, the development of the ideal Ba'athist leader, and the Ba'ath and Palestinian problem, America and Zionism, international terrorism, resistance against occupiers, who benefits from sanctions against Iraq, and the role of women in the mother of all battles, that is the first Gulf War. Now let's get into the Ba'athist party branches, the different political branches of the Ba'athist tree. Task of the branches: 1. Organizational activities. Following the party secretariat guidelines, party branches place emphasis on the organizational aspects of their responsibilities. Among those were recruitment, creation of new cells and divisions, election of members to branch committees, visits to other branches, and organization and conferences and meetings to spread the party's doctrine. Although recruitment activities among the young and students were a high priority, there was also strong emphasis on enlisting women, particularly in northern Iraq. Files of female members in the North show that many were young, aged 20 to 25, had finished high school, and for the most part were sympathizers or supporters. The lowest levels in the party pyramid. Some of these young women worked in factories, whereas others were housewives or employees in schools or government offices. Interestingly, the files of men involved with the party indicate a completely different profile. Most were in their 40s, and very few had been educated beyond primary school. Many, in fact, were only graduates of organized party courses to eradicate illiteracy. Whether men or women, Kurds or Syrians, Muslims or Christians, all had to fill in the cumbersome and detailed questionnaires and swear allegiance to the party and its leadership. Even those in northern Iraq who were simply joining to rank below that of a sympathizer, the national activity, had to sign a declaration based on the resolution by the RCC that anyone who joined the Ba'ath Party but had hidden other political affiliations would be hanged. In addition, anyone who severed their relationship with the Ba'ath Party and later became active in another political party would be liable for a 7-year imprisonment. Number 2, cultural activities. Ideological education aimed at molding the beliefs of the party cadre was intertwined with the general cultural education of the Iraqi people, and both were a major function of the party secretariat and the branches around the country. Cultural activity was seen as a major stage in the building of the Ba'athist character. Most of these cultural gatherings used the speeches of Saddam Hussein, the party's political reports, and publications endorsed by the Ba'ath leadership. Cultural education within the branches came in different formats: attending seminars, writing research papers, taking part in cultural competitions, exchanging cultural visits with other branches, participating in cultural conferences, joining Iraqi book fairs held in Arabic capitals, and replenishing branch libraries with appropriate reading material. Number 3, relations with the public. The Ba'ath Party, realizing that it could not rule the country through its members alone, needed to enlist the support of the public. Its leadership knew that there was an arena where it is not only the source of recruitment of the party, but where negative hostile ideas and actions could develop. The guidelines for branch activities were that the only discrimination among people should be based on their contribution to the party, both qualitative and financial. and that personal connections should be developed and continually encouraged in relationships. Strengthening ties with different groups of people involved participating in their happy and sad occasions and in social activities in the local area. Improving relations with the public took many forms during the regime's 35-year rule, and more importantly, also depended on the geographical area covered by in the branch question. After the war with Iran began in the early 80s, for instance, the party leadership had to confront the important issue of martyrdom. The branches became responsible for the task of taking care of the martyr's family and visiting them regularly to create a humanitarian example of the party's dealings with the public. In certain areas, such as Amara City, dealing with various tribes and building bridges with their leaders were essential functions. It was felt that regular meetings with tribal elders would help the branch understand the issues faced by different tribes in order to solve them in the spirit of the Ba'ath. In urban areas, on the other hand, there was an emphasis on establishing cordial relations with the academic and scientific communities. Given that Saddam Hussein was always in awe of scientists because of his belief in their vital contribution to the building of a strong modern Iraq, scientists were continually honored and rewarded by the party. It seems in some meetings, decisions of the Ba'ath leadership or speeches, that in some of the meetings, decisions by the Ba'ath leadership or speeches of Saddam Hussein were explained to the public, particularly those with economic implications for them. Some of these meetings involved charity work, such as collecting clothes for the poor and, during the sanctions in the 1990s, food distribution. Certain branches volunteered their doctor members to devote part of their time to treating without charge patients who lived in the area, whereas other branches paid for the medical care of citizens who were not affiliated with the party. Beginning in the 1990s, after Saddam Hussein changed his stance in regards to religion from being secular to launching a faith campaign, the party began to give prominence to religious occasions and pushed for a greater piety in Iraq as an Islamic nation. Hence, the branches became more involved in the faith campaign and organized meetings to explain the importance of religion for Iraq and its citizens. Number 4, political and security activities. Security activities were vitally important for the branches throughout the Ba'ath reign of power. The branches were the eyes and ears of the regime, and the lines between the security forces and the activities of branches were quite blurred when it came to dealing with the enemies of the regime, or carrying out the party's political or military plans, such as the Arabization of northern Iraq. Maintaining the regime's stability was seen as a core task for party branches, and they were responsible for doing what was necessary to perpetuate Ba'ath rule. Given the importance of this task, branches were encouraged to select only the most loyal and devoted members to serve on their security committees. These committees were charged with mapping strategies for gathering and establishing efficient sources of information among certain sectors of the local population, for dealing with the enemies of the regime in their areas, for checking rumors, for keeping appropriate files and documents on individuals, and for coordinating with security forces in their area. Number 5, the branch finances. Taking care of a branch finances were no less important than managing its relations with the public. Branches were expected to be financially sound, which meant collecting member fees on time, keeping within the budget, and fulfilling other duties such as maintaining their buildings and ensuring that all documentation and filing were in order. The main source of income, apart from allocations from party headquarters, was membership fees. They were collected on a monthly basis and were correlated with the person's rank. Lower ranks paid very little compared to others. The fees were relatively moderate, yet branches had difficulty in collecting them on time, and many members had to be reminded repeatedly of the need to pay their dues promptly. In their annual reports, branches emphasized the need to control and reduce their spending to be commensurate with their income. An important item in the expenditure was payments to needy members. As part of what became known as party responsibility, and based on Saddam Hussein's guidelines, party affiliates were told that they must take care of other members, both active and retired, who were in need of help. Emoluments were paid monthly to those in the category of friend, or venerated individual. And these payments assumed further importance with the economic deterioration in Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait. The survival of the Ba'ath Party and its leadership under Saddam Hussein can be largely attributed to the party's ability to expand and control its security apparatus. This system was established long before 1968, but Saddam Hussein perfected its working arrangements and utilized it in ways previously unknown in the history of Iraq. The security agencies were designed to overlap and were structured so as to ensure that no one agency would become strong enough to threaten the regime. There were four main security forces under the Ba'athist reign. First, the General Security, which monitored domestic opposition groups, ethnic minorities, and religious factions. It was responsible for patrolling Iraq's borders, particularly in the north, and it kept an eye on illegal economic activities such as currency trading and dealings in the black market. Two, there was the General Military Intelligence. This agency collected intelligence on the military capabilities of countries bordering Iraq, as well as on Kurdish forces. Besides gathering information, it acted as an internal force to detect enemy infiltration of the army by placing intelligence officers in every military unit down to the battalion level. In addition, it gathered information on Iraqi political dissidents abroad and monitored the activities of foreign military attaches in Iraq. 3. The Iraqi Intelligence Service. This organization kept tabs on Ba'ath Party members, monitored the activities of Iraqi students abroad, targeted operations against foreign intelligence services. And 4. The Special Security Organization, or the SSO, was set up by Saddam Hussein after he became president and was in essence the leadership's eyes and ears. It was the most powerful of all the agencies and reported directly to Saddam Hussein. In the eyes of the regime, there were many enemies inside and outside Iraq. One of the Ba'ath Party documents identifies at least 8 opposition movements inside the country, among them the Communist Party, the two Kurdish parties, the Kurdish Democratic Party, KDP, and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the PUK, the Dawa Party, the Muslim Brotherhood, any movements that had a religious cover, groups that had split from the Ba'ath Party, and any movement that pretended to be nationalistic. Saddam Hussein consistently branded any political opponent as foreign and called for distinguishing the fires of Shia and communism, as both were foreign. Describing the Communist Party in his book, he wrote, "Communism is foreign. Fahid is originally Farsi, Marx is Jewish, and Lenin was married to a Jewess. This is the reason the Soviet Union was the first country to recognize the Zionist entity." In Saddam Hussein's eyes, politicians who were Jewish or thought to be Jewish were tainted and not to be trusted. Alright, let's get into Saddam Hussein, the man and the leader. Since independence, Iraq had become accustomed to strong men, beginning with Faisal I and continuing after the toppling of the monarchy. When Qasim became the sole leader, the Iraqi people suffered long periods of instability and numerous coups d'etats that affected the country's growth and development. Saddam Hussein gave Iraq a certain sense of stability, and the economic boom jump-started by increased oil revenues and the nationalization of oil in the early 1970s provided him the opportunity to establish control over the regime and the country as a whole. Iraq advanced in all areas, particularly in the 1970s, and Iraqis who were not opponents of the regime or politically active benefited from the overall economic, educational, and social improvements. Among Saddam Hussein's greatest strength, however, was his ability to be flexible and even to reverse certain decisions he had made, in both internal and external policy. Sometimes when he had felt that he had miscalculated, he would change his mind. After Hussein Kamil fled to Jordan, Saddam Hussein became very introverted and began devoting a lot of his time and energy to writing books and reading poetry. Throughout his presidency, in fact, he devoted immense effort and resources to writing books, and some of them, such as The Immune Castle, published in 2001, were more than 700 pages long. Like his other books, it was published not under his own name, but as a novel by its author. As the war of 2003 was approaching, Saddam Hussein was very busy trying to finish his novel, Begone Demons, which according to one of the translators, Saman Abdul Majid, dealt with an ancient prophet and modern issues, and was an attack on the Jews, who were portrayed in the novel as demons. Saddam Hussein was very capable, worked very long hours, and had a photographic memory. Read daily hundreds of memos sent to him, and at least in the first decade was extremely well prepared for important meetings or decisions. This was evident, for example, in the nationalization of the Iraq Petroleum Company. A review of the president's activities published by Al-Thurata newspaper indicated the numerous meetings, conferences, and ceremonies he attended, in addition to meeting foreign dignitaries and Iraqi citizens. He never hesitated to ridicule ministers and senior officers if they were ill-prepared, thus increasing their fear and awe of him and making them very reluctant to express an opposing opinion even on trivial matters. Having witnessed what Saddam Hussein did to other members in the infamous party meeting in 1979 and the other cabinet meetings, few officials or ministers were willing to dissent. His untrammeled power extended to any individual in the society. And like Stalin or Mao, Saddam Hussein could have members, even in his own immediate entourage, incarcerated or killed without his needing to inform, let alone consult the others. And in 1979, that's when Saddam had his coup and took the full power of the Ba'ath Party, famously broadcast on television as he's calling out the names of suspected traitors or people being disloyal. And as they're taken out the room, many of them are proclaiming their innocence and their loyalty. I think there was around 70 people called out and maybe around 22 of them killed. So nonetheless, that was the 1979 consolidating of power. Decision-making, therefore, became mostly concentrated in the president's hand and epitomized the lack of consultation by the 1980s. The official statement, an order from the leader, the president, eliminated all discussion and became law in itself. Party documents give a dramatic insight into how Saddam Hussein's order became, in effect, the law of the land and penetrated into every sphere of civil and official life. A final issue, indirect and hypothetical, needs to be addressed. Who would have risen to power if Saddam Hussein had died naturally or been assassinated while the Ba'ath regime still ruled? Most likely it would have been Qusay. But interestingly, Saddam Hussein told his American interrogator that he had never made a final decision and never promised Qusay the leadership. The reason he gave is instrumental for our understanding of his paranoia and controlling behavior. He said he had learned from what happened in Oman in 1970, when the Sultan Qaboos assumed power in a coup directed against his father. The lesson was to refuse to yield too much power to Qusay at an early stage and make himself vulnerable. It is very doubtful that Qusay, at least in his initial years in power, could have built a personality cult like his father's. It is noteworthy that in Syria today, the cult of Bashar al-Assad is much less overwhelming than the one that existed for his father. Undoubtedly, Saddam Hussein was a unique phenomenon in contemporary Middle Eastern politics in how he skillfully developed, controlled, and maintained extreme power for such a long time. So let's go into the bureaucracy and decision-making of the Ba'ath. Get more into the nuts and bolts and the working of the Ba'athist government. The Ba'ath regime in Iraq was determined from the outset to create a powerful, centralized national authority, unlike many third world countries in which a weak authority is devoured by divisions that render itself shaky and ineffective. The party leadership, and in particular Saddam Hussein, succeeded in creating a large, centralized bureaucracy with the president at its apex. Besides his presidential role, Saddam Hussein was simultaneously the chairman of the RCC, Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party, Prime Minister, and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Like his elaborate security apparatus, which had systematic overlap in responsibilities in order to diffuse power, Iraq's bureaucracy had multiple organizational layers: the Presidential Diwan, the RCC, the party, and the cabinet, with its numerous ministries and quasi-governmental organizations. As vice president, Saddam Hussein began establishing the consultancy bureaus as early as 1969. Although these were under the aegis of the RCC, they reported directly to him. Throughout the 1970s, it became apparent to all concerned that these bureaus, which were supposed to be consulting, began to make decisions pertaining to civilian management in areas such as agriculture, the economy, law, Arab issues, and northern affairs. After becoming president, Saddam Hussein began creating a shadow state within the state in the form of the Presidential Diwan. And in the 1990s, it had become a nexus of power. Experts and directors in many fields, health, economics, agriculture, culture, education, and so on, were based in the Diwan, with large staff compiling reports that in many cases conflicted with what the particular ministry was recommending. The numerous Diwan departments supplied the president with information about different ministries, and its experts competed with the official ministers, thus diluting their powers. The documents indicate the extent of the Diwan's vast and intricate network in plotting the path for every decision, from security matters to improving the Arabic language. By the end of the 1990s, every bureaucratic measure flowed upward to the Diwan. Saddam Hussein's secretary, known as Abid Hamud, became in effect the second most powerful man in the country. All intelligence reports and ministry updates were sent to him, and he decided what Saddam Hussein would read, whom he would meet, and his daily agenda. In the system that developed, many orders emanated from verbal instructions given by Saddam Hussein to his subordinates, a method that the president preferred mostly for security reasons, which further strengthened Abid Hamud's position, as most subordinates would turn to him for more clarification. As we have seen, many rules and regulations were based simply on presidential orders with scant discussion or consultation. From the audio tapes, we can garner how the system of orders worked. Tariq Aziz described it in the meeting following the escape of Hussein Kamil. For 20 years, you made it clear to us that if we receive any order from you and we find it objectionable, we can question it and present it to you with our opinions and facts. If you were convinced, then that would be fine. But if you were not convinced, then the order would remain in effect. We are here to assist you. When you give them, your subordinates, the order to execute it, yes, it is hard to get in touch with the president, especially in the last few years for security reasons, but you can also write to Abid Hamud to give it to the president. So that's from audio tape, quoting from Aziz. And that's the thing with like many of these leaders or dictators. They try to portray them as just people that come up with crazy ideas and no one can question them, when that isn't true for most of the dictators. In essence, all major and sometimes minor issues percolated upward to the Presidential Diwan and the president himself for a final decision. For example, travel permits of party members outside Iraq could only be approved by the president. By 1990, Saddam Hussein decided he could not examine every case of punishment of party affiliates, and that only the cases of full party members would be brought to his attention. So Saddam definitely did like to micromanage a lot. Nevertheless, Saddam Hussein believed in competent management and reiterated that lack of organization is behind every failure. He had paid attention to many complaints sent by average citizens to the palace about the state and bureaucracy officials who refused to deal with them or were not willing to devote time and effort to solve their problems. He admonished these officials and preached modesty and humbleness as the appropriate attitudes towards citizens. The party was always seen as the source of political leadership and the state bureaucracy as the arm of executing orders and directives. Second, the party's involvement in the day-to-day management of the country changed with time because its own bureaucracy expanded rapidly during the 1980s and 90s, as the number of party members who were also employees holding mid-level positions grew significantly. The lines became increasingly blurred. Third, by the mid-1980s, the real decision-making was concentrated in the Presidential Diwan, and all other state organs were reduced to conduits of information and resources. Managing the economy. The Ba'ath Party realized that economic independence should be a central goal of the revolution and was as important as political independence. In the regime's early years, the Ba'ath, following its motto of unity, freedom, and socialism, wanted to build a united Arab socialist democratic society. It saw itself as a socialist revolutionary party, which considers socialism as a decisive necessity for liberating the Arab nation, and it sought to introduce as many steps as possible that would lead to socialism. In Iraq, there was no centralized economy, no forced industrialization, and no massive state-run attempt to mold peasants into industrial workers. Even at the beginning, the Ba'ath socialism was half-hearted and not strictly imposed. Before becoming president, Saddam Hussein talked about his vision, which was neither socialist, as in the communist states, nor a free economy, as in the West. Describing his vision of how the Iraqi economy would function, he told his biographer, Faoud Matar, that we believe the private sector and the socialist sector will go hand in hand forever. They are partners in service of the society. Now, this is, once again, third position economics on the head. They are partners in service of the society. We don't work for the economy works for us. It's essentially what that belief is. However, in the 1970s, more socialist measures, in particular nationalization and land reform, were enacted than in the 1980s. But similar to Egyptian socialism, Iraqi socialism was unwilling to sacrifice the needs of the present generation in order to raise money for future development. Iraqi's economy can be viewed as divided into three different periods. The 1970s were characterized by higher oil prices and an economic boom. The 1980s were dominated by the 8-year war against Iran, falling oil prices, and huge accumulation of debt. And finally, in the early 1990s, until the fall of the regime, the first Gulf War and international sanctions had a devastating impact on the economy and the Iraqi people. We will discuss each period to understand how the regime managed the economy during those phases. 1970s. Fakhrid Qarouri, the Minister of Economics who ran the Economic Bureau at the RCC for 6 years, describes in his memoirs how Saddam Hussein was very involved in all discussions and made sure to be well prepared before the meetings of the Planning Council. He also led the studies and the negotiations that resulted in the nationalization of the oil companies, which began January 1972 and continued until all foreign-owned shares were nationalized in late 1975. With oil prices almost quadrupling after the 1973 October War, oil revenues became significant. This allowed the regime to cement its economic control through a system of patronage and by creating networks of complicity and dependence. Using oil revenues, the government plowed large amounts of money into providing free healthcare and education, expanding the country's infrastructure, organizing large construction projects, and investing in industry and the military. And that just goes to show what happens when you have the Ba'athist ideology or other third position ideologies who nationalize the oil or take control of import-export. They use the wealth for what? Free healthcare, education, building infrastructure, modernizing the city. Compare that to the individual oil company. Are you getting free healthcare from Standard Oil? No, you're not getting no free healthcare for them. There's no doubt that by the end of the 1970s, Iraq was climbing the modernization ladder and achieving high scores among developing countries in terms of education and healthcare. Its per capita rose from Iraqi dinari 97 in 1968 to about ID 825 by the end of the 1970s, and its gross domestic product more than quadrupled during the same period. So I think, just like in the Nazi economy video, when we look at how the economy functioned from 33 to 38, which were the pivotal years of how underneath their philosophy the economy would work. Then you have wartime economy after that. I think if we look at how Iraqi Baathism worked within the economy, the 70s was the best place or the best period in time to see how it would work, because the 80s were taken up with the Iran-Iraq war, and then the 90s was the U.S. invasion, and then the sanctions that lasted and crippled them all the way until the U.S. came in and finished the job in 2003. So I think the 70s show we see their GDP quadrupled underneath Ba'athist educational and economic principles, and their per capita income went from 97 to 825. So, break out the calculator and figure out how much of a rise that is. So, and this is what Iraqis don't have today. This is what Iraqis don't have today, even with all the American money that's been put into it, even with all the taxpayer money going into Iraq right now. They couldn't even get what Saddam Hussein was able to create by simply nationalizing the oil. Okay, we go on. Raising the standard of living was seen by the party as paving the way for the future Baathification of the country by proving the regime would deliver prosperity. Although the ideology was socialist in theory and the country was going through a decade of intense statism, in the 1970s the private sector grew with the expansion of the economy thanks to huge public expenditure, which stimulated private investment. We go on. The 80s were dominated by the 8-year war against Iran, and the sharp drop in oil prices caused significant slowdown in all the rentier economies in the region. Many countries launched new liberalization policies intended to stimulate their economies, and Iraq was no exception, including liberalization and privatization policies. The agriculture sector was an interesting example of a dramatic shift of policy in which the regime sold agricultural land to private sector after years of socialist-style land reform and sequestration that had begun in 1959. This was attributed in part to the labor shortage during the Iran-Iraq War. In fact, the country faced more serious economic issues than just labor shortage, which was partially resolved by importing more than millions of workers from Egypt and other countries. Iraq's reserves, accumulated during the boom years of the 1970s, had dwindled by 1983, and as the war continued, the country began borrowing heavily, mostly from Gulf states. Yeah, so once again, the 80s were plagued by the Iran-Iraq War, so we start to see a downturn here. We start to see them privatizing, trying to get the most bang for the buck for that moment, to keep the country going and feed the war effort. All educational scholarships were halted unless fully paid by a foreign government, and no payment in cash for any project was permitted unless it was related to the war effort. Another party priority during this decade was the distribution of food and essential supplies, while simultaneously strengthening the blockade against the northern village allied with the Kurdish insurgency. Efforts were made to balance the budget by increasing production and savings while cutting private consumption and employment in government offices. Desperate for cash, the government decided to invite foreign companies to invest in oil fields. From the mid-1980s, it became clear that Iraq was not going to be either socialist or a free market economy in the true sense. As Saddam Hussein told in a meeting in June 1987, the state should not embark in any more uneconomic activities, and any such activity has to have a return. In the same speech, he said the emphasis would put on the quality of output, and that as part of the liberalization, he ordered the security organizations not to ask people about the source of money for imports, and this led many to stop importing for fear of the security organizations. The cost of the 8-year war against Iran was immense in terms of human and economic losses. Its length and severity probably cost the two countries more than 1 million lives and consumed almost 112% of Iraq's gross national product, the GNP, annually between 1980 and 1988. By 1989, Iraq's economy was significantly different from that of 1979. Massive destruction of infrastructure, particularly in the south, heavy indebtedness of about $42 billion to Arab and foreign countries, a weak currency, and worst of all, deteriorating oil prices. Crude oil fell from an average high of about $32 per barrel during 1981 to an average low of $12 to $14 in late 1988. At the same time, the regime had to continue its militarization and rebuild the infrastructure. Once again, the looming crisis forced the government to change its economic policy, and it increased civil service salaries and offered subsidies on certain products. Okay, from early 1990s to 2003, given the continuing slump in oil prices, the refusal of some Arab countries to abide by OPEC quotas, and the suffocating burden of the country's debt, Saddam Hussein believed that a quick solution to this evolving crisis was to invade Kuwait, which he did on August 2, 1990.
Also, there was the accusation of slant drilling. Iraq accused Kuwait of dipping into their oil, and I've never actually seen this accusation factually disproven. For whatever reason, the effort was never made to disprove that claim. And also the historical context of the land. When the British mandate drew up Kuwait as its own entity, It essentially took the coastline away from Iraq. So there was that historical argument of land. I mean, this is exactly what happened during World War II as well with Germany. Same kind of situation.
The consequences of this were dire for the country and its people. Soon after the invasion, Iraq's foreign-held assets were frozen. An embargo was imposed by the UN on its oil exports, which caused oil outputs to grind to a halt, resulting in severe loss of revenues. From the time of the Allied attack in early 1991 until the ceasefire was signed on February 28, 1991, following the liberation of Kuwait, the country suffered heavy infrastructural damage to the extent of almost 90% of Iraq's electricity grid was destroyed. The strict international sanctions imposed on Iraq after the war profoundly affected the lives of Iraqi citizens and forced policy changes to adapt to their consequences. The regime felt threatened not only by the uprising and continuing tension of the international community, but also the ongoing economic deterioration. Scarcity of food was an enormous issue facing the population. The magazine The Economist reported in 1995 that the society was reduced to a pecuniary and semi-starvation, and quoted UN reports that nearly 30% of children under 5 were severely malnutritioned and that the social fabric is collapsing. The regime invested considerable financial, administrative, and political resources into administrating and maintaining food rationing. Ration cards became extremely valuable, and although each citizen was supposed to receive the same amount of food, party members, senior army officers, and civil servants were entitled to a higher allocation. The lethal combination of hyperinflation and currency devaluation obviously encouraged smuggling and the black market dealings. Study prepared by the party underlined about 43% of the population at some point used the black market, whereas 18% consistently traded in it. The report identified the scarcity of goods as a major reason for the involvement in the black market. But for some citizens, it was the long lines to purchase products that prompted them to turn to the black market. No wonder in these dire circumstances that corruption spread into every facet of life, particularly after 1996 when Iraq began selling oil under the UN's Oil for Food program. Estimates of illicit income from surcharges on oil sales and bribery range from 270 million to more than 7 billion. An independent inquiry into the Oil for Food program estimated that Iraqi surcharges were around 229 million. And that in allocating its crude oil, Iraq had instituted a preference policy in favor of companies and individuals from countries perceived as friendly, such as Russia and France. So, and you start seeing the effect of the sanctions, and these are how sanctions are used. I know people have this perception, like we have sanctions on Iraq and sanctions on Iran today, that, oh, you're crippling the government. Oh, you're taking it to the government of Iran when you're doing this. Well, these sanctions don't hurt the people in government. They're going to have enough food. They're going to have enough security. They're going to have whatever luxury they're used to. The people, the citizens, is who it affects. This is who starves and dies. This is who needs to stand in a 2-hour bread line. This is who doesn't have the proper education anymore, or even the sanitary items to take care of themselves, or to live a decent and civilized life. And so they try to starve out, kill, malnutrition, disease riddle the mass of the people, in order to get them to hate their own government, because they're going to start blaming them for all their hardships because they can't do anything about it because they're blocked off from the world now. So these are the points of sanctions: to cripple, kill, maim, break the back of the public until they finally have had enough of that and figure, let's revolt against the government, maybe things will change. So yeah, this is always the end of sanctions. Doesn't do anything to the people in power per se, unless, like I said, you can put the public through so much misery that they eventually do your bidding. It's just another way to ferment revolution in foreign countries by a soft imperialistic hand. As the economic situation deteriorated throughout the 1990s, the middle and professional classes suffered debilitating setbacks, not only from the scarcity of food, but even more from the staggering inflation and currency devaluation that depleted their savings. They adopted survival strategies to maintain consumption levels in the face of dramatic declines in their purchasing power, such as working several jobs, having their children operate as petty vendors, bartering for goods, and selling assets and household items. One major consequence of this crisis was the brain drain of Iraqis' professionals and educated middle class. During the 1970s and the 1980s, waves of educated Iraqis had fled to the country in search of a better life. Among them, many of the teaching faculty in the Baghdad Medical School and specialist physicians. However, after the events of 1990 and 1991, significant numbers of Iraqis began to leave when they realized that after 2 wars, the opportunities for professional careers would dwindle dramatically. As the fabric of Iraqi society began to unravel, the demise of the middle class was exacerbated, and some estimates put the numbers of Iraqis in exile by the time of 2003 invasion at 4 million. The government attempted to attract people back in Iraq in the 70s and 80s by introducing many incentives, and it intensified its efforts in the 1990s. The party prepared a detailed study recommending steps to stem the immigration of academics and created new incentives for those returning. The study emphasized the importance of Iraqi scientists. Capabilities such as the chemical weapons and long-distance rockets, which raised Iraq's profile among the peoples of the world, and were the pride of all Arab and Muslims, determined the battle with the Persian enemy, and shook Israel's structure for the first time. Were not the product of illiterate labor, but were manufactured by engineers, chemists, physicists, and biologists, who were graduates of the Iraqi universities. Although the Iraqi population at large suffered from the sanctions, the regime was not seriously affected. In essence, the sanctions probably expanded the role of the Iraqi state and increased regime stability. As a result of the success of the rationing system, the Ba'ath Party managed to increase its support and empathy among civilian populations during the 13 years of harsh sanctions. So it pretty much backfired what they were trying to do, break the back of the people to get them, to hate their government. But since the Ba'ath Party did such a damn good job of rationing the food and kind of bringing people together and taking care of everyone the best they could, it built more loyalty and support for them from the people, because they saw how they were taking care of them and doing their best with all the sanctions against them, to try to feed the citizen, to try to keep them educated, to do the best they can underneath the current situation. In fact, not only did the authorities manage to reconstruct most of the destroyed infrastructure, but the economy began improving by the late 1990s. Between 1996 and 2000, Iraq's GDP was estimated to have increased from 10.6 billion to 33 billion. Their currency stabilized, albeit at a much devalued rate versus the dollar, and inflation was the only continuing problem. The regime itself amassed a vast fortune during the period of 1990 to 2003. Just like our economy, inflation is the only continuum, right? That's the only thing you're sure of. Inflation is going to continue. Things are going to cost more and get smaller. The recovery in Iraq's economy in the regime's remaining years should be seen against the impoverishment and destitution since the late 80s. Still, the regime felt comfortable enough that by the end of 2002 to launch a 10-year plan to bring economic prosperity to the Iraqi citizen. And in the 2 years prior to 2003, Iraqi newspapers were full of editorials exalting the regime's economic accomplishments. Well, how did that 10-year plan work out to bring economic prosperity to the Iraqi citizen? Old George W. and the neocons that did his thinking for him took care of that. Don't you worry, little Iraqi. No economic prosperity for you, just constant religious wars from different tribes and from Kurds and from everything else. On top of that, with the UN and America's boots on your soil and bases in your land now. That's what you get. Dare you have a Ba'athist society? How dare you? We will bomb and beat liberalism into you. Don't you worry. Let's go on to the unions and professional organizations. After 1968, when Iraq became a Ba'athist state, the unions, as in Syria, were dominated by the party, and popular and professional organizations were created as part of its populist corporatism to control different sectors of society. The documents clearly indicate the co-optation of the unions, which were turned into professional associations under the control of the party apparatus to serve its needs. Purging disloyal union members was no different from the same task in any other government ministry. Case in point occurred in 1980 when a new Secretary General was appointed to the labor union. On taking the job, he wrote to the party secretariat suggesting that because of the control of traders over the Secretariat General of the labor union and the General Union for Iraqi workers for many years, which had affected the workers from educational, disciplinary, and moral points of view, the leadership should be purged and replaced by new members. The memo does not explain or indicate why the previous leadership was a group of traitors, but it could be assumed that some of them were connected to the conspirators against Saddam Hussein who were exposed in the infamous party meeting of summer 1979. Before a new labor law was enacted in mid-1987, Saddam Hussein wrote a long article about the decision to promote all workers to the level of white-collar employees. He indicated that previous laws had retained a class distinction and had gravely damaged productivity. He emphasized that the party has neither promoted class struggle nor made it an ideological platform, and that the trade unions in Iraq emerged as a reflection of their counterparts in other countries. But these unions have fulfilled their task thanks to the awareness of the Ba'ath Party. In other words, the unions carried out their work due to the support of the party, and now it was up to the party to represent everyone. Labor Law number 71 of 1987 dissolved the labor unions and confirmed that workers in the public sector would become members of the civil service. It guaranteed every worker the right to earn a wage that was adequate to meet his or her essential needs and those of his or her family, and confirmed the rights of working hours and retirement. The Ba'ath Party and women. The Ba'ath Party, secular and socialist, saw itself as a movement seeking the resurrection of the Arab nation and was hence bound to encourage Iraqi women to improve their status in society in the conviction that liberating them from economic, social, and legal shackles was necessary for growth and prosperity in Arab society. In 1971, President Saddam Hussein told the General Federation of Iraqi Women, the GFIW, "We are all, in the party and government and in the social organizations, expected to encourage the recruitment of more women to the schools, government departments, and organizations of production, industry, agriculture, arts, culture, information, and all other kinds of institutions and services. We are called upon to struggle tirelessly against all the material and psychological obstacles which stand in our way along this path." The number of girls attending primary and secondary schools increased sharply throughout the 1970s, and the number of women attending university grew from about 9,000 in 1970 to more than 28,000 by 1979. The party also focused on illiteracy, which was far more widespread among women, 70%, in an effort to appease the religious groups in Iraq and to counter the appeal of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the looming shadow of Iran's larger population. The regime launched a series of measures that were to have a deep impact on the status of women. 1 year into the war, the RCC decided to encourage early marriage. Interest-free loans were provided to any man under the age of 22 who would marry if the prospective groom was a student. He and his future wife would be entitled to free accommodation in the university dormitories. Encouraging early marriage remained a core policy until the collapse of the regime in 2003. Many government offices took part in arranging marriage ceremonies and circumcision of children on their premises. Together with special bonuses for these families, the second major law in 1987 encouraged increased fertility. Financial rewards were given to families who gave birth to a fourth child after this law came into effect, and for those who already had 4 children, bonuses would be paid for future births. Another thing you typically see with third position ideology is the birth rate always improves and the nuclear family becomes stronger. Although the country was in dire economic straits from the end of the 1980s, women's share in the economically active population in the formal economy did not show a significant statistical decline, staying at roughly 11% between 1987 and 1997, and women continued to constitute roughly 1/3 of university students between 1989 and 2000. Women were enrolled, albeit at a limited scale, as volunteers for the Popular Army beginning in 1977 and later in the Jerusalem Army until the 2003 invasion. Some women were allowed to enroll in the Army and Air Force, although Saddam Hussein expressed reservations about this and believed that many countries allowed women to enlist in the armed forces as a masquerade that would not necessarily lead to equality. And he's right about that. It hasn't led to equality. It's led to trying to dumb everything down. Physical requirements have become more lax in the last 30, 40 years, just here in America. And it's the same thing. And so he's right about that. It's a masquerade. It's not going to lead to equality. You're not going to build a bunch of superwoman soldiers that can keep up with the Navy SEALs and all this. No, it's insanity. But it's a masquerade, like he said. Okay, let's go on to the Ba'ath Party and religion. Although the regime was secular in nature, at least throughout the 1970s, it was not publicly anti-religious. Our party does not have a neutral position towards autophagy and faith. It stands with faith always, but our party is not and should never be a religious party. Saddam Hussein's position on religion and mosque attendance was very clear to his comrades, as he did not mince his words. In one internal party meeting in the early 1980s in which religion was discussed, one member said that religiosity increases immunity, to which Saddam Hussein immediately replied, "A Ba'athist does not need religiosity for immunity, as he has the immunity of Omar, the Caliph." Similarly, when it was reported to him that some senior officials were attending mosque or praying during working hours, thus forcing subordinates to imitate them, he declared at an internal gathering that members are not allowed to pray or attend a mosque as a group, as it would create undue pressure on their colleagues, including the non-Muslim ones. Before he changed his public policy in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein emphasized that the Ba'ath should oppose the politicization of religion by the state and within the society. When the issue of sectarianism came to the fore after the 1991 uprising, he told his inner cabinet, which included members of the RCC and the party's regional command, that he was completely oblivious to the differences between Sunnis and Shiites. And the first time he encountered the issue was when he was living in exile in Cairo and someone asked him whether he was Sunni or Shiite. He mused on the fact that no one from Tikrit would know the difference. Much has been written about Saddam Hussein's radical policy shifts from anti-tribalism to pro-tribalism and from secularism to religiosity. But the files clearly indicate that the regime remained to the end suspicious of all religions and all religious activities. There was thus a dual policy of public religiosity on one hand and monitoring and suppressing of all the religious activities on the other hand. Saddam Hussein's attitude to Islam was that superstition had taken over the religion and had become the way to reach religion. He told his top aides in 1990, "Allah is neither Sunni or Shiite, he is neither Catholic nor Protestant," and that most people moved away from real religion to pursue other philosophies that had no connection to religion. The authorities were convinced that Saudi Arabia was supplying cash to groups acting against the regime. Even throughout the 1990s, everyone showing an inclination towards Wahhabism was considered an enemy of the state. When reports reached the party that an attendant appointed in a mosque in Mosul was suspected of being a Wahhabi, the authorities were alarmed and took steps to replace him. The documents clearly illustrate their concerns about the fanatical Islam emanating from Saudi Arabia. 2 months before the 9/11 terror attacks in the United States, a secret and urgent order for Saddam Hussein was sent to the heads of branches ordering that all imams in every mosque must announce that Wahhabism was an infidel movement, and any imam who refused would be punished and dismissed from his job. That's who we attacked. That's who America attacked Iraq for in connection with, right? He's friends with bin Laden. The regime was sensitive to its position with regard to religious groups. By 1991, Saddam Hussein was claiming to be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and his cousin Imam Ali, as part of strengthening his own personality cult. Yeah, pulling the old Julius Caesar descendant of Venus move. Because of anxieties about the power of the Shiite religious establishment in Najaf and Karbala, the RCC decided that anyone apart from Saddam Hussein who claimed that his roots
were from the family of the Imam Ali would receive a 7-year term of imprisonment. The Ba'ath Party had a complex relationship with Islam. On one hand, it was a secular party whose founder was a Christian. On the other hand, the party grew in an Islamic environment and was fully aware of the importance religion has in the Arab world. Hence, Saddam Hussein found it easy to adopt Islam as a part of his political oratory and used it to great effect. New mosques were built, and Saddam Hussein issued public orders to repair and improve existing mosques in different provinces. Time and again, Saddam Hussein, in speeches and directives, urged Iraqis to observe the Quran and underlined the importance of building a generation that would derive its ethics from the Quran and whose lifestyle would be based on the rules and customs of the Prophet. Later in the 1990s, over a period of 3 years, a 605-page Quran was written using Saddam Hussein's blood. And that's still around, I believe, in some private museum that's like off limits to people visiting. All right, now lastly, to finish it all up, children, youth, and students under the Ba'ath Party. A number of organizations were established to train children and the youth both physically and politically. The Vanguards catered to children aged 10 to 15. This was later replaced with Saddam's Cubs. For those aged 15 to 20, there was the Youth Organization. In a detailed appraisal of youth training based on data from 5 camps attended by 1,221 students, it was concluded that although the military training was good, the physical training was less successful, and the weakest link was the cultural activities. 10% of the students interviewed said that relations with the officers were mediocre, but the majority described their relationship with other students as good. Others in the party complained about the lack of discipline in these camps and the high absenteeism. Saddam Hussein concluded that insufficient resources were devoted to educating the students politically and demanded an enhancement of cultural programs. As a result of these reports, the RCC decided that any student who was absent for more than 7 days would fail their academic year, even if they were to pass their exams. In addition, students who had committed serious breaches would be expelled from their schools, banned from party activities, and drafted into the army. And these things, of course, like most of these youth organizations in other third position countries, were created to build brotherhood, to build physical strength, and to give them a political education on the philosophy behind the party. And so that is it. That wraps up our look into the concept and ideology of the Iraqi Ba'athist Party. We see there's times, especially in the 70s, where it thrived when you had an economy and a public life that was no longer unsettled and disrupted by constant military coups d'etats, was not molested by foreign wars and foreign invaders. You see the vast improvements that took place underneath this nationalistic, neither communist, neither capitalist Ba'athist Party in its ideology. We see even through the struggles of the Iran-Iraq war through the 80s, they're able to maintain, and even through the crippling sanctions, which are going on today in Iran and North Korea, even through the crippling sanctions, they were able to solidify and keep the support of the people with the ways they dealt with the rations and how they pulled together to help people survive. And then also the great brain drain upon them, where a lot of their academics left seeking a better life in foreign countries, which always hurts a country when you lose your intellectuals, when you lose your scientists. It's crippling to a country. It's crippling. It's taking apart. All the way up until the end of 2003, the Iraqi Ba'athist Party stood as a shining example of an Arab nationalistic government that even through the hard times was able to survive and then even slowly start to thrive again. As was pointed out, they were coming back on the economic climb, even with the sanctions. They had to do a lot of dirty deals of money under the table for oil. And, you have to do what you have to do to survive, especially when you have, this world imperialistic power through international finance, using its biggest bully on the block, the good old US of A,
to come and, beat you up, dunk your head in the toilet and all that stuff. It's like, even through all of that, they were able to maintain and slowly start to strive again and they even started to create their 10-year economic plan, which, once again, how's that going? But anyways, that was the concept and ideology of Iraqi Baathism. Suggested reading: Saddam Hussein's Baathist Party by Joseph Sassoon.
إذا أنا اليوم أروح يم التمثال يعني أتألم وأنقهر، أقول ليش أنا يعني سقطت هذا الصنم، أعيد الصنم احتمال يعني أصنعه وأعيده لو خوفا دول يقتلوني أرجع. أنا أكثر من عائلتي، يعني أكثر من 14 15 شخص معدوم. كنت فرحان بشكل، يعني دخلوا الأمريكان وخلصونا من نظام صدام البائد. سمعت بأن الأمريكان دخلوا ضواحي بغداد، ففرحت وأخذت المطرقة هو الهمر شاكوت وطلعت بالسيارة. بديت أضرب بالصنم لأن أمنيتي هي أسقط الصنم. قبل ما انسقط صعد أحد الجنود من شرق آسيا خلى العلم الأمريكي على وجه التمثال، فأنا مقبلي حطيت علم عراقي. حقيقة سنة عن سنة للأسوأ، وبعدين كشفنا ذول الحرامية والأحزاب والقتل والنهب والسلب. قتل صدام بس يعني ما شفنا من مثل هاي الحكومة. راح صدام وجانا 1000 صدام. أحس كأنما إحنا العراق مأخذ من عندنا وبغداد يعني بصورة عامة، هم كانوا يدعون بها سقوط بغداد، وهاي الكلمة يعني تأثر من عندها. لا شيء أكيد كذابين، أي كذابين لأنه هم دمروا العراق ذول الاثنين، بير وبوش. هم رجعونا للصفر، ويمكن أقول لك رجعنا للقرون الوسطى وأكثر. أنا لو مجرم يعني أقتلهم بداية.